Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight's story takes us to South Korea, to a place called Pohang. Back in the 90s, a huge apartment complex was built there. It was supposed to be a dream home for hundreds of families. But what happened after it opened became one of the country's darkest mysteries. This is the story of M Apartment and the woman from room 1301. In the early 1990s, South Korea was in the middle of rapid economic growth. New cities and housing complexes were being built everywhere, and the city of Pohang was no exception. That year, a massive residential project called M Apartment officially began construction. It was said to be one of the largest private developments in the region, consisting of 27 buildings that could house over 1,000 families. At first, the project drew a lot of attention. The media called it a symbol of Pohang's modernization, and local residents looked forward to the new shops and parks that would soon follow. But from the moment the first steel beam was raised, something about the site felt uneasy. The first death happened on a hot summer afternoon. A worker was found lying in the middle of the construction site. There were no visible injuries on his body, but he wasn't breathing. A few days later, another young worker suddenly collapsed. By the time he reached the hospital, his heart had already stopped. Both deaths were strange. Neither man had been struck by machinery, nor had there been any sign of a fall. The autopsy reports listed the same cause of death, cardiac arrest. That was when the workers began to feel afraid. Some said the two men had heard strange noises the night before their deaths, as if someone was walking around between the unfinished floors. Others claimed that late at night, after work, they saw the faint outline of a woman standing near the foundation. Her hair was long, her clothes pale gray, and she just stood there, motionless, staring at them. Word spread quickly. Even people living nearby began to avoid the area. Street vendors said that at night they could hear a woman crying from inside the unfinished buildings. Others claimed that before dawn, they saw human shapes moving across the top of the cranes. What unsettled everyone the most was one thing the dead men all had in common. In the days before they died, each had mentioned seeing the same woman. She never spoke. She only stood far away, with a faint, unsettling smile on her lips. Rumors spread fast. Some said the construction site had been built over an old cemetery. Others believed the developers had cut corners and angered something that shouldn't be disturbed. The atmosphere at the site grew heavier and stranger by the day. Still, despite the whispers, construction continued. By 1993, M Apartment was finally completed. 27 white towers standing neatly on the outskirts of Pohang, clean and modern. At the opening ceremony, the developers smiled in front of the cameras and said, "This will be the safest and most comfortable community in Pohang." No one knew that the real horror was only just beginning. After M Apartment was completed, new residents quickly began to move in. The location was convenient, the prices were reasonable, and since the buildings were brand new, they sold out fast. No one mentioned the strange deaths that had happened during construction. Everyone believed that the misfortunes had ended along with the building work. In Building 112, room 1401, lived a young couple who had just gotten married. They both worked in the city, kept regular hours, and loved to exercise. After moving into their new home, they started a routine, jogging together every morning around the complex before going to work. It was a small kind of happiness, the calm life of newlyweds. One clear morning, with hardly any wind, they went for their usual run. When they reached the path behind the apartment, the husband suddenly stopped. His wife turned around and saw him standing perfectly still, staring ahead, lips moving as if he were talking to someone. But there was no one there. She thought he might be on the phone, but when she looked again, there was no phone in his hand. She called out to him a few times, but he only nodded slightly, as though saying goodbye to someone, then jogged back to her. When they returned home, she couldn't hold back her curiosity and asked, "Who were you talking to just now?" Her husband smiled casually. "The woman from downstairs, room 1301. She asked which floor we live on, so I said 1401. She said we should get to know each other since we're neighbors. The wife froze for a moment. A chill crept up her spine because she remembered clearly. Room 1301 had always been empty. She forced a smile and said nothing more. That evening, they came home separately after work. When she opened the door, the apartment was completely dark. Her husband was lying on the bed without turning on the lights. She stepped closer and gently tapped his shoulder. The instant she touched him, her whole body went rigid. Her husband's eyes were wide open, the pupils rolled upward. His face was pale and stiff, frozen in an expression of terror, as if he had seen something that shouldn't exist. She screamed for help, and the neighbors called the police. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was already gone. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. After the funeral, the wife couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Her husband's last words echoed in her mind. The woman from room 1301. She finally gathered the courage to ask the building manager. The manager looked puzzled. Room 1301? That unit's empty. No one's ever rented it. Her face went pale. She nearly fainted on the spot. The story spread quickly throughout Building 112. Residents whispered that the woman from room 1301 was the same gray-clad figure workers had seen during construction. Some claimed that when they passed that floor at night, they could hear the click of high heels echoing down the corridor. A few steps, then silence, as if someone were waiting for a door to open. No one knew the truth, but from that night on, the halls of Building 112 became quieter than any other. After the man from room 1401 died under strange circumstances, the atmosphere in the entire building changed. Although the building manager and the developers insisted it was just a sudden cardiac arrest, many residents began whispering behind closed doors. The phrase, "the woman from room 1301, quietly spread through the halls. In room 808 lived a middle-aged couple. The husband had worked in the same company for years and was known to be calm and steady. His wife was a homemaker who liked to grow flowers on the balcony. They had been living there for almost a year without any trouble. Although they had heard about what happened in room 1401, they didn't believe in ghost stories, thinking people were simply being paranoid. One ordinary evening, they were eating dinner, chatting, and watching TV together as usual. Everything felt normal until the husband suddenly mentioned something small. "I ran into a woman from upstairs, from room 1301, near the elevator today," he said casually. His wife looked up, startled. "Room 1301? Isn't that place empty?" He laughed. "She said she lives there. Asked me if I live in 808. Said we should say hi next time we meet." "How do you know she really lives there?" "I don't. Maybe she just moved in." They shrugged it off and kept watching TV. Later that night, the husband went to bed at his usual time, but the wife couldn't fall asleep. For some reason her heart was racing, and she kept hearing faint noises, the wind outside, the soft echo of footsteps somewhere in the hallway. Around 3 in the morning, she thought she heard a gentle knocking sound at the door, like someone checking if anyone was awake inside. She told herself it was just her imagination, closed her eyes, and waited for morning. When the sun came up, the room was unusually quiet. She turned and saw her husband still lying in bed in the same position as the night before. She reached over and patted his shoulder. "Hey, wake up. You'll be late for work." No response. She patted him again, a little harder. Still nothing. She sat up and looked at his face, and froze. His eyes were wide open, his lips slightly twisted, his face pale gray, staring blankly at the ceiling. She screamed and ran into the hallway for help. The neighbors came, the paramedics arrived, but it was already too late. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. The police found no injuries or signs of struggle, and doctors confirmed he had no heart problems. The case was identical to the one in room 1401, sudden, inexplicable, and terrifying. Fear spread through the entire building. Some residents moved out immediately. Others stuck talismans on their doors or drew crosses on the elevator mirrors. Soon, a warning began to circulate among the residents. Never tell anyone which room you live in. And whatever you do, don't answer the woman who asks, "Do you live in 808?" After the incident in room 808, the entire building 112 was shrouded in fear. Even though the developers and police claimed the deaths were coincidences, simple heart attacks, no one believed them anymore. Residents avoided the 13th floor at night and hurried past the elevator without looking inside, just hoping to move out as soon as possible. In room 705 lived an elderly couple with no children. After retirement, they relied on each other and lived quietly. Because their apartment was large, they rented out one of the rooms to a university student named Junho, who studied nearby. He was polite and soft-spoken, often helping the old couple with chores, fixing things, or carrying groceries for them. Over time, their relationship became like family. The couple often warned him, "Strange things have been happening in this building. Don't go out late, and don't talk to strangers." The old man would add in a serious tone, "If a woman tells you she lives in room 1301, ignore her. Don't speak to her, just leave." Junho thought they were just being superstitious, but he nodded anyway. One night, as the couple was about to go to bed, they suddenly heard frantic knocking on the door. The old man opened it and saw Junho standing there, drenched in sweat, his face pale as paper, trembling all over. Between heavy breaths, he said, "I saw her, the woman from room 1301. She asked where I live, and I told her." The old couple turned pale and quickly pulled him inside. "Calm down," the old woman said. "Maybe you just imagined it." But Junho shook his head. "No, it wasn't my imagination. She was in the elevator, wearing a white dress, her long hair covering her face. She asked if I live in 705. I said yes, and then she smiled." That night, none of them dared sleep alone. The three stayed together in the living room with the lights on. By morning, the couple woke up to find Junho lying quietly on the sofa. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, his face frozen in terror. He wasn't breathing. The cause of death, again, was cardiac arrest. It was the third unexplained death in the building within just a few months. All the victims had the same signs: rigid bodies, terrified expressions, and no visible injuries. And before they died, each of them had met the woman from room 1301. The police investigated again, but found nothing. Room 1301 was still vacant, no tenant, no water or power usage, no record of anyone ever entering. The manager opened the unit with a master key, but what they found inside was unsettling. The place was spotless, without dust, without cobwebs, as if time itself had never touched it. The incident in room 705 became the final straw for the residents. After Junho's death, the residents of building 112 finally had enough. 3 deaths in a row, all from cardiac arrest, all the same expression, all too close together. Everyone now believed that the woman from room 1301 was not human. The residents joined together to protest, demanding that the developer refund their money in full. At first, the company refused, insisting that the building had nothing to do with the deaths. But the protests dragged on for years, and as newspapers began reporting on it, public pressure mounted. Eventually, the developer gave in. In 1995, they officially announced full refunds for all residents of Building 112 and permanently sealed off the entire building. After that, the woman from room 1301 was never seen again. Years later, some people claimed that M apartment hadn't disappeared at all. It had simply been renamed. Photos posted online showed a complex in Pohang called Yubong Apartments, with a layout almost identical to the old M apartment. The building numbers went from 101 to 125, except there was no building 112. The photos sparked heated debate. Some said this was proof that Yubong Apartments was just the old M apartment under a new name. Others argued that the numbers didn't match. The legend said there were 27 buildings, but Yubong only had 25, so it couldn't be the same place. Still, the legend of room 1301 remains one of Korea's most enduring urban ghost stories. Some say it's nothing more than an internet myth, but others believe every word of it, that somewhere in Pohang, behind a new name and fresh paint, The woman from room 1301 is still waiting.